I'm Alex, and unsurprisingly, we're talking about books today, but more specifically the meaning or the secrets, for want of a better word, that they hold. So I'm of the opinion that books provide a catalyst for experience. It's impossible to experience everything in the world firsthand, just as it's impossible to experience the past or have conversations with those long dead. Books fill that gap. They allow us to experience what we simply cannot, and interact with those who perhaps lived in an era that we wished we lived in ourselves. And there are many books that offer this, and perhaps within them the key to a good life. The rough categories of books that I believe are most important within this are, first, self-help books, philosophy, narrative histories, and fiction. Before we get into it, it should be important to note that within each category there are good and bad books. The following ranking is only to suggest what the overall picture in my opinion, and it should be noted as well that this is something that I'm still thinking through, and really this whole video is an amalgamation of those thoughts. I'm not trying to say that I've arrived at the correct answer, but this is just what I, albeit in my short time, have found to be true. It is perhaps also to keep in mind the questions of why do we look to books? Why is that something that we feel is important in answering and improving the lives that we live? And do they even hold the answer? Are we just looking in the wrong place? Perhaps it is actually first-hand experience, no matter how limited, is the key to discovering more. I don't know, and I don't think that we can ever know. But as I've said, I think experience is paramount to learning what is best for you and what works best for you. And it is of my belief that books can accelerate this process and is a shortcut to experiencing a lot without necessarily having to go through the actual physical process of experiencing. So without further ado, on to self-help books. When it comes to thinking about how to improve your life, I feel that self-help is the most obvious answer to people. They are marketed in that manner, and arguably the sole purpose of a self-help book is to provide a means to improve your life. However, I find them unrefined in the ideas that they present and lacking complexity because of it. The self-help books I read tend to be a lot of filler, and they do that through the use of anecdotes. So they'll have an overarching thesis, and that will be supplemented to flesh out into a book by adding in a lot of anecdotes, when really perhaps all they need was a sentence, maybe an Instagram post, a short YouTube video, or the such, but perhaps not a book. After all, there is a reason that most people skim these books and don't necessarily read them cover to cover. And don't get me wrong, I understand the economics of it. Why not turn it into a book? You'll make more money, better for the publisher. So I get that. And now it seems that anyone with a vaguely large social media following is encouraged to write a book and present their expertise in a manner of usually a self-help book tied in with a autobiography, and it's your short time in the limelight, you've got to capitalize, and that's fine. But admitting all of that does not improve the quality of self-help books. They are pseudo-autobiographies with a few tips thrown in and a few life lessons that these people have gained along the way, which is fine. And, you know, for a fan of the person, I'm sure it's very insightful, but to have a better life, to say something profound about the way in which you live, I'm not sure that this is the right place for it. And this is not to say there aren't good books written within the field, but they're just not for me and what I'm looking for when I read a book. I find that they have limited appeal and really just an overly verbose package of what could be summed up in a sentence. I believe that philosophy then is the step above that, as we see that more complexity begins to develop. The complexity arises as within good philosophy we should have ideas that are pitted against one another to see which one comes out on top. The complexity of philosophy over self-help is that good philosophy, good being the operative word here, should take ideas and theses that the author may or may not believe and pit them against each other to see which is the most true. A philosopher should test their own ideas and hold them up to scrutiny and follow whatever happens to the logical conclusion without introducing bias into it. Not that that is ever really possible. A philosopher should follow an idea and see where it ends up, not force it to a predetermined conclusion, which perhaps is a trait more found in self-help. An idea that someone had sounded good, nice slogan for the marketing, and then they run with it. Not that philosophy is the epitome of scientific thought, but there is slightly more debate within philosophy as opposed to within self-help. Nietzsche said that he philosophized with a hammer and struck every idea to see if it rang true. And I think this is a methodology and a mindset that we should take to all ideas and all of our own opinions. And by doing it, it simply makes us better thinkers. Philosophy is also more discursive, interacting with the ideas that have come before it and either building upon or rebutting those ideas. Self-help, on the other hand, tends to exist within a bubble. It's the idea of the author and that alone. They have their idea, the points that they want to make, and they're going to make it. Nothing's going to stop that. It could perhaps be argued that philosophy is merely the term that we give to self-help books when they're not of our era, when they're more antiquated. It's interesting to think that these self-help ideas and gurus of how to live a better life have existed for millennia. Reading Plato and his Socratic dialogues, particularly Meno and the Sophists, we see that people trying to sell you a good life, and however dubious those claims are, have always existed and always will be. But maybe we just tend to give them a different name if they're old enough and have withstood the test of time. Another draw that I have to philosophy is that it lacks the marketing of self-help books. It's the ideas and the ideas alone within philosophy that are asked to stand up, whereas self-help books written at the moment are always attached to a marketing campaign. There's a persona and a personal brand that is driving it and is being sold along with the book. The philosophy is less in your face. It's not connected to a book tour. It's not going on every podcast that's in existence. And perhaps that's why I just prefer the more low-key take that philosophy has. On to the next section of narrative history, and perhaps this can even be grouped with fiction, as they do share very similar traits, but I think differ in one key area. I believe that together, narrative history and fiction combine the complexity of ideas that philosophy presents. However, they put them forth in a more practical package, in a way where we can see them being played out. Philosophy is a meditation. It's the theoretical pursuit of an idea in general. Although philosophy can vary in its practicality, I think Seneca's Letters from a Stoic are an example of quite practical philosophy. But were they necessarily written as philosophy? I'm not sure what category I'd put Seneca's letters into, although a lot of people do put them as philosophy. But perhaps you could almost construe them as a social history, an understanding of how people live. Seneca's letters sits in an interesting position between the two. Like philosophy, narrative history and fiction test ideas, but the manner in which they test them is not as a thought experiment, but rather allowing characters or people to live out those ideas. What consequences do they face? How do they live once they put these ideas into practice? The difference being that one is grounded in reality, the other is not. Which is better? It's hard to say, but I would lean towards that fiction is better, the one that's not grounded in reality. As sometimes we need to step outside for us to see the true picture. And it comes back to the philosophical. In my experience, it's very rare for a narrative history to introduce the philosophical, as they, in the case of a historical biography, are dealing with one person, the philosophies that they held. And it's rare that we see an individual have this internal struggle between philosophies, and we don't see it played out as we can't know their thoughts. It's hard to know the battle of philosophies that an individual within a narrative history has. Fiction, on the other hand, particularly great fiction, such as that of Dostoevsky, really takes that element of the philosophical, which is so good, and places it within the fiction. The philosophy is tested within the world that the author creates and is allowed to play out as naturally as it can do. Again, depending on the quality of the author, let's say. And this is precisely what we do in our own lives when we're imagining the future. We think of what we could do, how we could behave, and then imagine how it would play out. We do this without having to act. And so in this manner, we can let bad ideas die and preserve ourselves. And this is augmented as we continually understand the world better and better. Or hopefully it's a process moving in that direction. The better that we understand the world, the better we can envisage how these experiences or how these actions and philosophies will play out. The better calibrated we will be in the understanding of our actions, so that we can better decide whether this is the path that we want to take or not. And it's for this reason that I believe that fiction is slightly superior to narrative histories. However, both are superior to self-help and philosophy. And well, unfortunately for the self-help genre, although they're doing very well for themselves, I'd put them as the least useful in terms of finding the ways to live a better life. Although on the surface, they are the most accessible, perhaps. Philosophy improves upon self-help by packaging those ideas in a better way and holding them up to scrutiny. And the narrative style takes it one step further by bringing those ideas that have sometimes been tested and putting them into reality, allowing them to play out so that we can see the consequences. As mentioned with Seneca, it's not so easy to split books up into these 4 categories in terms of self-improvement, although I'm not the biggest fan of that term, as a lot of books cross categories and it's hard to place them. Maybe this means that they're better books because of that. Man's Search for Meaning blends the narrative history with a philosophical discussion. Arrian and Quintus Curtius Rufus's histories of Alexander the Great blend the fiction with the narrative history, and it's quite hard to tell where those distinctions occur. And we see in Les Miserables by Victor Hugo and War and Peace by Tolstoy, the fiction and the historical side by side, divided into neat exposition that takes place, with the occasional philosophy thrown in as well. Those 2 books really are an amalgamation of the categories that I put forth, or the better ones of those categories. And perhaps it is a reason why we imagine them as great books. Not only do they have the fictional, but they have a strong philosophical chord running throughout them, as well as the historical element that is attracted to that. It's a social history, an opportunity to explore that era, one that we can become immersed in, with a great story, with great prose, and with challenging philosophical thought, where there really is no clear answer. By reading, we are subconsciously running simulations. We're exploring different avenues of being and assimilating those that appeal to us within our own psyche. This brings us to perhaps a more philosophical question about reading. Is it really an assimilation, or are we actually waking up things that were already inside of us? I don't want to really delve into that today, perhaps a topic for another day. Although if you have any thoughts on that, then I'd be very interested to hear that. And thoughts about what I've said today. I don't know if this is right. These are not initial thoughts, but, well, as with everything, it's always in development. There's no perfect answer, particularly in topics such as these. But what I do believe for sure is that reading broadens our experience, no matter what we read. It's all good. Do I currently believe that reading fiction gives the richest experience? Yeah, in my experience, I do. But that's certainly not to say that all fiction is great. And that's also not to say that I don't think that I've read some very valuable philosophy and narrative histories. I'm going to hold judgment on self-help books. I haven't read them all, so I can't say that they're useless as a genre. But from the ones that I've read, I found them lacking. Anyway, I'll be interested to hear your thoughts. Maybe I'll make a follow-up to this video somewhere down the lines if my thoughts change and perhaps compelled by some of the comments. But that's what I think for today. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you in the next one.